Thank Ethos event and Mr. Poranautis from SAFE for the invitation to join this event. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm very pleased to talk about the new regulations for medical devices and IVDs, and hopefully contribute with another flavor to the very interesting discussion we have today. So, new regulations, after many years of negotiations, discussions between the Council, the Commission and the European Parliament, they've finally been published on the 5th of May. And the industry is eagerly awaiting the implementation of the new regulatory framework, which is envisaged under the new regulations for in vitro diagnostics and medical devices. The new regulations modernize the regulatory framework in Europe and lay out a number of new requirements that will need to be met and will require implementation from all stakeholders within the years to come. So, as you can see, the regulations increase not only the number of pages and articles in comparison to the current directives, they add more details, many new requirements that will need to be implemented. The new regulations envisage additional requirements for manufacturers and other economic operators, including authorized representatives, distributors and importers. They intensify the burden for compliance. However, the basic fundamental elements that are required in bringing the product into the market remain unchanged. So, as you can see on the slides, the elements from product design, conformity assessment to post-market follow-up remain the same in terms of the features of the system that currently exist under the directives. However, the new regulations add more detail. In fact, they don't remove any of the existing requirements that are included under the directives, but just add new requirements. So I wanted to talk about the major changes that are coming with the new regulations and the elements that will need to be put in place. Of course, as you've seen, the text of the new regulations is very voluminous, but it's important to focus on the main aspects that are going to change. The most obvious change is the sheer number of requirements, the documentation that will need to be produced by the manufacturers, and the number of different types of information that the regulators want to know. But the main, focusing on the main changes for IVDs, these include a new risk classification system. The regulations move away from the current positive list of in vitro diagnostics enshrined in Annex 2 lists A and B under the directives, and they set up a completely new classification system aligned with the internationally adopted guidelines based on risk classification. Another major change is the tightened conformity assessment procedure for IVDs and an oversight of notified bodies. Around 85% of IVD products that are currently on the market will need to meet an oversight from a notified body for the very first time. This will be a challenge not only for the manufacturers and economic operators, but also for the notified bodies to be able to meet the capacity and availability issues that are expected to come. There are also new clinical requirements, clinical evidence requirements that will be required before the products can be put on the market, as well as new performance study requirements for high-risk procedures. Many of these provisions are considered to be copied and pasted from the clinical trials regulation. Another major change includes an increased transparency, as a lot of information about the devices and the studies is going to be made public. New regulation also establishes a database, a European database, that is going to have a central role in implementation of the new regulations as approximately 75 provisions that are included in the regulations are tied to the functionality of the European database, the so-called EUDAMED. And with regards to the IVD regulation, this regulation also expands its scope and includes, for the first time, companion diagnostics, in-house assays, and different products that would not be addressed under the directive, etc. So all these requirements that constitute a major overhaul of the regulatory system for IVDs since the 1990s have been developed with an aim to ensure that IVDs comply with the stringent standards for quality and safety and produce reliable data to be used for diagnostic purposes. As for the medical devices regulation, the system is going to be modernized and strengthened with the new scrutiny procedure envisaged for high-risk devices, more detailed clinical evaluation requirements, also increased checking by notified bodies, especially with regards to the clinical information. In general, increased commission and authority control and monitoring of the strengthened system of the notified bodies, which has already undergone through changes through the recommendations that have followed the outcome of the PIP scandal. The regulations also set up the unique device identification system that will enable identification of devices, but the idea goes beyond that. It also envisages enabling traceability of devices throughout the supply chain. Other changes include up classification of certain devices, for example, surgical meshes from class 2B to 3. There might be also some changes to software. Regulated reprocessing of single-use devices, and again, increased transparency, information on devices, and the summary and safety of performance is going to be publicly available through EUDAMED, which again has a central role in the regulation. All these different requirements are expected to lead to increased fees from the notified bodies, resulting from engagement of experts and scrutiny procedure, and national fees levied by competent authorities, etc. And again, this is the regulations establish. The idea was to meet the requirements of the existing nature of medical devices and IVDs, and to establish a more robust legislative framework to ensure better protection of public health. The regulations lay down a lot of details, a lot of obligations of economic operators. In that regard, distributors and importers are newly included in the scope of the regulations, and they would be also required to meet specific requirements that are explained in the regulations, and these would include verification of whether the product has a CE mark, storage of UDI data, reporting of incidents, etc. Depending on the type of activity pursued, different responsibilities would be triggered. At Medtech Europe, we tried to map out the different requirements. I don't know if you can see it from back there. You can, of course, hopefully recognize that there's a number of obligations that economic operators need to be made aware of in order to comply with the new rules. Now, all these requirements, of course, there is a transition period envisaged. The regulations have been published on 5th of May, entered into force 20 days after, and the medical devices regulation envisages 3 years transition before the date of application, with some additional transitional provisions for the medical device certificates issued before the date of application. And for IVDs, the transition period is 5 years. During that time, products can be placed on the market either under the directive or under the regulation if manufacturers are able to meet the requirements. What is important to understand that during the transition period, and also considering the additional transitional provisions for notified body certificates, products that bear CE mark assigned under the medical devices regulations are equally safe. There's going to be a lot of effort needed from the regulators, economic operators, notified bodies in order to implement the provisions of the new regulations, and this is going to take time. We also expect a number of legislation still to be published in order to implement the requirements envisaged in the regulations. Now, speaking of the secondary legislation, as I mentioned, the regulations lay out the general framework. They set up the new regulatory system for medical devices and IVDs, but they will still require a lot of legal acts to be issued in order to implement some of these requirements. The secondary legislation in form of the so-called delegated and implementing acts. The regulations envisage nearly 80 pieces of this secondary legislation, some of which are compulsory, others are voluntary. So it is not to say that all 80 will need to be published by the time the transition period runs out. However, we consider 14 of those secondary pieces of legislation to be vital for this system to work, for setting up the framework, for issuing the procedure for the designation of notified bodies, setting up the UDAMED database, UDI system, etc. Now, at Medtech Europe, we represent manufacturers of medical devices and IVDs. So, of course, the regulation is very close to our heart, and we've tried to identify the elements that need to be in place in order to make the transition successful. And we've identified the so-called showstoppers that would make this transition difficult or impossible. So, in terms of the IVD regulation, there are several elements that need to be in place. This includes guidance on the new classification system and performance evaluation requirements, implementing acts for conformity assessment procedure, the level of depth of the notified body overview for Class B and C, transition of the currently adopted common technical specification into the new, the so-called common specifications for highest risk IVDs, the availability and capacity of notified bodies. As I mentioned, around 85% of IVDs will need to deal with notified bodies for the first time. It is not only a challenge for manufacturers or economic operators, but notified bodies will equally need to be prepared to be able and have competence in dealing with these new products for them. UDAMED system, as it was highlighted, a lot of the requirements rely on fully operational and functional UDAMED database that will be set up at the European level. So it is imperative that the system is set up in time before the transition period runs out. The UDAMED database is going to have a very important role if you think about the unique device identification database that has been set up in the US under the FDA UDI final rule. In the US, the database addresses only one part of the requirements, which is the UDI. In Europe, the idea behind the database is to have a more robust source of information for registration of economic operators, registration of devices. This includes UDI data, vigilance, clinical investigations, etc. So it is important that that the complexity of the database is not underestimated. Vigilance system will require some implementing acts to be issued in order to be implemented in place. And in general, there is a need for overall clarity on the new governance system. We did a similar exercise for the medical devices and identify several areas that could be considered as the showstoppers. So in general, for medical devices, it is imperative that we have clarity on the transitional provisions envisaged under the under the new regulation, so that in order to enable all economic operators and notified bodies to meet the timeline and transition into the new requirements. Notified bodies, here the issue for medical devices is slightly different in nature. For IVDs, there is a clear capacity issue in terms of the new products coming into the scope, and that will need to be reviewed by the notified bodies for the first time. For medical devices have a shorter transition period. The designation process for designating notified bodies under the medical devices regulation under the new rules is only to be started within the next month. It is still unclear how much time the designation process will take and at which point the notified bodies will be available to issue certificates for the MDR. So, of course, there is a high level of concern regarding the availability and capacity also for medical devices. And in general, guidance on equally clinical requirements, even though different nature of clinical requirements is going to be needed under the medical devices regulation to enable manufacturers and economic operators to fulfill the requirements, as well as notified bodies in terms of what is expected from them when it comes to evaluation of clinical data. And other elements include, again, UDAMED, which is also considered as imperative for medical devices regulation, UDI, where clarification is needed with regards to a definition of the so-called basic UDI-DI. That is a European definition not included currently in the FDA or the IMDRF guidance. So there's an urgent need to clarify the scope of this definition to enable manufacturers to implement it in their systems. And again, overall clarity on the new governance of the system. Economic operators, manufacturers, we are not alone in dealing with the requirements. The Commission, competent authorities, notified bodies, they recognize the workload, hopefully recognize the workload that comes with the new rules. Here I just wanted to show you the implementation priorities of the European Commission, which include indeed the notified bodies, including the related implementing acts. So what is important for the European Commission is to facilitate the procedure that will enable notified bodies to apply and be designated under the new rules in order to fulfill their rule envisaged under the new regulation in a timely manner. In general, the governance of the system, so setting up of the medical devices coordination group, expert panels and reference laboratories, which I understand is going to happen soon. Development of common specifications for products that are newly in the scope, so devices without a medical purpose or reprocessing of single-use devices. This is also already underway. Establishment of UDAMED database and the UDI system, which is a big project. And other priorities include issuing a mandate for the scientific committee to develop guidelines on phthalates, which is mentioned explicitly in the medical devices regulation. In fact, today the European Commission and national regulators are hosting a stakeholder meeting where they are presenting their updated roadmap of a project plan on how they plan to implement the medical devices regulation and IVDR in order to meet the timelines. So, new regulations, challenge or an opportunity. the number of requirements, the number of questions that remain unanswered and uncertainties seem to indicate that, of course, implementation of the regulations is going to be a challenge. But with every challenge comes an opportunity, and as long as the stakeholders realize the workload and investment that is going to be needed in order to make implementation of the new regulations a success, the benefits are there and the opportunities are there to implement the new regulations and to reap the benefits of the new regulatory system. So thank you very much for listening. I welcome your questions.